Thank you, Demi, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you to Dr. Sampson and Dr. Jones in their absence. To you two awesome preachers, thank you so much for setting me up to fail. Won't you pray with me? God, my prayer is simply that you be glorified and that everything unlike you be terrified. In Jesus' name, amen. Beloved, a couple years ago, a song by artist and pastor Travis Green called Made Away was released. In fact, this song has probably helped some of us in the room get through some really rough times since its release. The song simply says, "You made a way. When our backs were against the wall and it looked as if it was over, you made a way. And I'm standing here only because you made a way." And Travis and his wife have been very transparent about the testimony behind this song, that it was written after his wife's water broke at 21 weeks into her pregnancy, to which the doctor reported that their little baby boy would not make it, but rather the doctor reported that their son would die. But praise be unto God that their child is a living testimony that God is a miracle worker. But what strikes me about their testimony is where they were standing when he penned these hopeful lyrics. It wasn't when they took their little baby boy home. It wasn't when the song was released, but rather Travis began to declare these hopeful words even in the midst of the situation. He began to pen these hopeful words right there in the hospital. He declared, "You move mountains. You cause walls to fall. With your power, you perform miracles. There is nothing that's impossible, and we're standing here only because you made a way." And what's striking to me is how they were able to worship God right there in the midst of uncertain circumstances. It was bewildering to me how they were able to worship God even in that low place, even in that dry place. And I would venture to say that they worshiped God in the midst of a valley. And that's significant to the point of our text, beloved, because here at the point of our text, it offers for us a glimpse of what it looks like to worship God in the midst of a valley. It is a declaration of a people who are on the journey to the temple in Jerusalem to worship God, and it is while they are headed to commune with God, it is while they are headed to higher heights, it is while they are headed to do something great that the text says that they pass through a valley called Baca. Now, that word Baca in Hebrew means weeping, which means that on their journey to higher heights, they had to go through not just a low place, not just a dry place, not just a weary place, but they had to go through some not so joyous places. They had to go through a valley called weeping. And many of us in here today can testify that there have been some times in our lives where we've had to pass through the valley of weeping. If we could be honest in here today, we can admit that not every day has been sunshine and joyous, but there have been times in our lives where we had to declare like the old folks, "Lord, walk with me while I'm on this tedious journey. I want Jesus to walk with me." There will be times where life will lead you into some weeping valley. And so then the question becomes, since we cannot avoid these weeping valleys of life, how then can you worship while you're going through a valley? How can you worship when you've got more bills than money? How can you worship when your projected graduation date has been pushed back a semester and now you have to stay another year at a school you already don't really want to be at? How can you worship when you've put in application after application and yet the job still hasn't come through for you yet? How can you worship when we live under a presidency that continues to perpetuate sexist and racist ideologies? Beloved, I want to suggest to you that even though there will be times you have to go through some weeping experiences, that there's still hope in the valley. As a matter of fact, why don't you turn to your neighbor and tell them my sermonic thought for this moment. Neighbor, there's still hope in the valley. Now, I'm real Baptist, so I'm going to give you 3 points and we're going to be out of here. If you're going to remember that there's still hope in the valley, the first thing you have to do is you got to learn how to remember your destiny. The text says in verse 5, "Blessed are those whose strength is in you, in whose hearts are the highways to Zion." In other words, beloved, while they were going through the valley, the way they found their strength was keeping Zion in mind. It was by keeping their destiny in mind, because they understood that there was something greater ahead of them. They understood that even though they were going through a valley. Their destiny was to get to where God wanted them to be, which suggests to me that while you are going through the rough places, while you are going through the low places, while you are going through the dry places and the weeping places, you have to remind yourself that where I am isn't where I'll always be, and that what I'm going through does not compare to what I'm going to. But I can worship God in the valley because I remember that there's greater on the other side. So that, yeah, you might be having a rough year at school, but graduation is on the other side. You might be experiencing a rough time finding a job, but keep applying because a job is on the other side. You might not be preaching all around the country, but keep on serving, keep on studying because your time is coming. Is there anybody in here that can suggest to your neighbor that you have to remember your destiny? But then number two, you have to learn how to reinterpret your dilemma. Because watch this, the text says, as they go through the valley of weeping, they make it a place of springs. Now notice that the text doesn't say that they were weeping. Rather, it says that the valley was called weeping. And I'm not suggesting that it's not okay to cry. As a matter of fact, I support that. If you got to cry, cry, boo, get your cry on. But what I want to suggest is that when you are experiencing the weeping valleys of life, you and I have a choice. And that choice is that we can either conform or transform our perspective. I'm going to say it again. We have a choice when we're going through our valleys to either conform or transform our perspectives. Because watch this, the fact that they weren't weeping, even though they were in a place of weeping, suggests to me that they did not allow their external dilemma to infect their internal disposition, but rather they decided that what they were going through did not have to dictate their posture of worship. They had to declare that I might not have a job, but I will bless the Lord at all times, and his praise shall continually be in my mouth. I might not have my degree yet, but I will lift up mine eyes into the hills from whence cometh my help, because my help comes from the Lord. I might have just broken up with somebody I thought I'd be with forever, but the Lord is great and greatly to be praised. And I might not see the promise of God realized in my life just yet, but God will never leave me nor forsake me. But watch this, beloved. Look at how the text says they activated their agency in the situation, because the text says that while they were going through the valley of weeping, they make it a place of springs. And I have to be honest, y'all, I was a little confused about how they were able to make springs out of a dry place, because a spring, a well, is something that you take from. It's something that you benefit from. So how in the world is it that they can be going through a dry place? They could be going through a low and sad place and still get something out of that. But then I was reminded how I showed up on the campus of Nyack College in 2012 and owed them a debt that I could not pay. But after working hard and studying hard, somehow I graduated with honors in 2016. I had to remember how all those black mothers in the community activated their agency by making something out of nothing when all they had was a little cornmeal and some water and some seasoning, and somehow they were able to feed their children. I had to remember how blacks didn't have basic civil rights. All they had were a few churches, and somehow a movement was started. Beloved, I want to suggest to you that the people in the valley learned to make the best out of their situation. But then watch this. It says that the early rain also covers it with pools. In other words, you can make the best out of your situation. You can, while you're going through the valley, remember that even though you aren't seeing the fruit of your labor, even though things don't look the way you think they ought to look, you can reinterpret your dilemma by activating your agency and making the best out of your situation. Because watch this, God is also working. Because watch this, a spring is only the instrument that holds water. A spring is a well. It is a vessel that has the capacity to receive and to retain water. And the text says that God is working to cover it with pools. In other words, when they put themselves in a position to receive, God provided what they needed. And beloved, can I suggest to you that you ought to learn how to position yourself for the provision of God? Yeah, it takes faith to go to seminary, but God will see you through. through. It takes faith to go into ministry, but God will provide opportunities to serve. It takes faith to walk away from unhealthy and dysfunctional relationships, but God will restore you. And I just believe that that is why the people could worship God in the valley, because they had the faith that God would see them through. So much so that the psalmist said that as they were going through the valley, they went from strength to strength. In other words, the situation is making them stronger. It's making them better. In other words, the valley has then become the incubator. It has become the training ground, so that when you leave the valley, you leave better than you were when you came into the valley. Because when you decide to worship, even though you're going through a valley, your change of your perspective will cause the valley to become the catalyst for a radical declaration. And that's my third point, that there will be a radical declaration, because the text says that for a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. Y'all, the psalmist says it's better. And the word better here is used to insinuate a dichotomy between two things. That the only way you can declare that something is better than something else means you have had to experience it and the other. In other words, I would not know that God's presence is better unless I knew what it was like to be on the outside of his presence. And that's why every now and then you ought to look back over your life and think about how God has brought you through. You ought to look back and see how far God has brought you, and let that be the inspiration for your worship, so that while you are going through the valley, you can remember that this isn't God's first time bringing you out. You can remember in the valley that this isn't God's first time keeping you when you couldn't keep yourself. You can worship God in the valley when you remember how God stepped into darkness and made something out of nothing. You can worship God in the valley when you remember how God delivered Israel out of Egypt. You can worship God in the valley when you remember how God delivered Daniel from the mouth of the lion's den. You can worship God in the valley when you remember how God delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from that fiery furnace. You can worship God in the valley when you remember how one Friday Jesus died, but he rose again on that third day morning with all power in his hands. Beloved, we ought not despise what we've been through, because your weeping valley is the very thing that will inform your worship, so that now you can declare that better is one day because I've had some good days. Better is one day because I've had some hills to climb. Better is one day because I've had some weary days. Better is one day because I've had some sleepless nights. Better is one day because when I look around and I think things over, all of my good days outweigh my bad days. And I won't complain, because, beloved, there's still hope in the valley. God bless you.